Hi viewers and our friends of this channel. Welcome to another exciting session on making you all industry level software developers. So as usual, the most important question first. Are you ready to become industry level software developers? Yeah? Good, awesome guys. Okay guys, let's do it now. So today's lesson is objective C, adaptive user interfaces, making apps adaptive, lesson 2, continuation of the introduction and a simple practical, right? And we'll be using Xcode version 11.4.1 for practicals and Apple developer docs for referencing. Okay guys, let's go on. Let's move. Okay, so let's immediately look into where we stopped, right, in the previous lesson. So we started talking about adaptive layouts and interfaces, and I'm going to start with something very important for you to keep in mind. But just before that, let's move into, yeah, auto layout guide, right? Okay, so let's base our discussion starting from this point onwards. So if you remember, in the previous lesson we said there are three approaches. One is you start with doing things with stack view, right? And if possible you do it with stack views so that you don't go to the next stage, right? You finish it at this stage, you just give the constraints only for the stack view, right? And you put all the components inside the stack view and you don't worry about putting constraints for those, right? For this adaptive interface. Then second approach is, if it's not possible to do everything in a stack view, then only you go into look into auto layout, and then you go into that trait system. Now when we say that, we ask you to start with auto layout, sorry, stacked views, right? But if you remember something very important, we said even the stack view, though the components are put into stack view, the stack view you will add constraints using auto layout, or if not, even you can add constraint to the stack view using that trait system, right? So let's start with that. Keeping that on mind, let's move forward. So if you remember, when we were looking at that original document, it directed us to 2 points. If I scroll down to show you, see, for developer guidance, auto layout guide and trait. So now I'm going to start with the auto layout guide, right? So looking at the auto layout guide, okay, so understanding auto layout. So what's this, right? So what's this? So auto layout dynamically calculates the size and position of all the views in your view hierarchy. Let's read a little bit on this. Let's read a little bit, right? So auto layout dynamically calculates the size and position of all the views in your view hierarchy based on constraints placed on the view. So based on the constraints placed. So who should place these constraints? So the auto layout dynamically does it, right? Does it, but that's done based on the constraints placed, which means someone who has to place the constraints. So mainly it's the developer, right? Also keep in mind, when you place components into the storyboard, into a view controller, when you place components, there are some default constraints, right? There will be some default constraints, but the default constraints doesn't suit all the situations. You will see it in a little while, right? So then you have to make sure that you change the default constraints and add some meaningful constraints for them to be adaptive, right? For example, you can constrain a button so that it's we saw this earlier, centered with image, right? That's good. We saw it in the previous lecture. If the image view size or position change, the button position automatically adjusts if you have auto layout. So if you have a button, basically what it says, if you got a button below an image, and if you have said always 8 points below the image, the button should come. If the image changes, the button will always maintain that 8 points, right? So that's what it says. So this constraint based approach to design allows you to build user interfaces that dynamically respond to both internal and external changes. So this approach, so now keep in mind, moving forward, our approach for adaptive user interface development, adaptive UI is a constraint based approach, right? So constraints are rules, and these rules are being used by the auto layout system and the trait system, right? So they go hand in hand, right? And the constraint based approach allows respond to both internal and external. So there can be internal changes or external. So they just simply explain what are external changes and what are internal changes. So what are these external changes? External changes occur when the size or the shape of the super view changes, right? If the super view, meaning, let us say if you have a button, and let us say if the button is placed on a view controller, so the super view is the view controller, something like that. So external changes occur when the size or the shape of the super view changes. uh, with each change you must update the layout of your view hierarchy. And so what is this view hierarchy? That's also something very important, because in any Xcode project, when you place some components, there is a view hierarchy, right? So let me show you. Let me show it to you, right? Let me show it to you now. Give me a second. So I'm going to start Xcode project. Let's say new. Okay, create a new project, single view app. Next, and then I have to give a project name and the location, right? So let's give a project name and a location. Okay, so I gave a project, I gave a name to the project and created the project. So when I say view hierarchy, if you look at your storyboard, let's look at the storyboard. So 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 if I expand this, so this is where it shows you the view hierarchy, right? So this shows you the view hierarchy, and let's see what you see here, right? So let me do like this. So if I add a button, let us say, just for example, right? So if I add a label or a button, let's say a label, right? So if I add a label into this, can you see? So it shows me the view hierarchy, right? So label is here, it's a view, and it's inside a view controller. So this is a view hierarchy, right? So I just wanted to show you the view hierarchy, guys, right? Okay, so let me save this for a second, right? Okay, and let's look into this, right? Okay, so let me now go back to the, what we were. So that's the view hierarchy. So with each change, you must update the layout of your view hierarchy, right? So this is now, once again we are talking about external changes. Just focus on this. So how does the auto layout react to these changes, right? So external change occurs when the size or the shape of your super view changes. With each of this change, you must update the layout of the view hierarchy to best suit the value. So here, it gives some common source of changes, right? The user resize the window, right? It can be the user resizing the window if it's OS X, OS X environment, or user enters or leaves a split view. You saw earlier on iPad, or the device gets rotates, So all these are examples for external changes. And you remember in the previous lecture, we said that with these changes, with each of these changes, the environmental changes, the system reacts to it, right? So these are a couple of good examples. And in fact, you want to support different screen sizes, right? Likewise, right? Yeah, all good. So now you understand there are external changes, right? So the external changes will also make things to change. Then what are most of changes occur, so most of the changes will occur at runtime, right? It's very clear that they occur at runtime, and they require a dynamic response from your app. So that is also very clear with what we discussed. So as it says, most of the changes occur at runtime, especially user rotating the device and things like that, right? And they require dynamic response from the app, right? Yes, right? um, like supporting different screen sizes, etc, etc, right? So auto layout is like is also a key component for supporting, yeah, split view. So we saw all that. So that is external changes, right? Then how about internal changes, right? So internal changes occur when the size of the view or control in your user interface changes, right? So what does that mean? The size of the views or controls in the user interface changes. Now let me give a good example. It's here, it's over here. The content displayed by the app changes. Let us say there's an image, and you dynamically upload image view with images, and let us say there's a slightly larger image. So that's what it says. So internal changes occur when the size of the view or the control in user interface changes, right? Or let us say you have a text box with intrinsic size. Intrinsic means it's the default size which it has, and it can grow and shrink, right? And for example, let us say a label or button has an intrinsic size. Let us say it fits into the data, right? So for example, there's a button with a text, and say if you dynamically update the text of the button, then it has to get adjusted, right? So that is when the size of the view or the control in your user interface changes internally, right? So that's the most important thing to understand in this. It's the internal change it's talking here, right? And the and various other examples. So when your app's content changes, then what happens? The new content may require different layout than the old, right? So for example, if you embed some larger text, right, into a text view or text, or so then or a larger image, then what happens is you will need a different layout. There's a possibility, right? So this commonly occurs in apps that have, see, that displays text or images, as I mentioned, right? For example, in a news app, right? So in a news app, it needs to adjust its layout, right, based on the size of say individual articles, right? Of likewise, so those are good examples, right? Right. So these they are talking about different examples, right? So now once again, put your focus in the right direction. So the focus here is about auto layout, and then we started by talking the auto layout will react to two different changes, right? The constraint based approach, external and internal. Now you realize what are external and internal changes, right? Then they also talk about things like auto layout versus the frame based layout. So now keep in mind, guys, there are different approaches when it comes to designing the apps, right? There are different approaches when it comes to designing the apps. So the idea here is we are focused on a few things, right? So we are not going to touch everything at once, so that it's going to be difficult for you to grasp things. So in that sense, now I'm going to tactfully, discuss the remainings until we come to the main point. So let's see. They say there are three main approaches to layout, laying out a user interface. You can programmatically layout, right? Now that's another option, right? So when it comes to layout components, there are different approaches, right? So they say three main approaches, right? When it comes to laying out a user interface, putting stuff. You can programmatically layout interface. You can use auto resizing masks to automate some of the responses, or you can use auto layout. So there are different approaches for you, right? Some programmers prefer to do things programmatically, right? And then add plug in certain code so that it gets adapted, right? Anyhow, traditionally, apps laid out their user interface by programmatically setting the frame for each view. This traditional approach was we are programmatically setting the frame for each view in a view hierarchy. The frame define the view origin, height, so on and so forth. This was traditionally the approach was programmatically setting the frames and setting its environment so that it fits into, right? So then in order to do that, there are many ways. In many ways, programmatically defines views frame flex. It gives a lot of flexibility. It's true. It gives a lot of flexibility when it comes to things. But let us see, the point here is this explains how that works, right? Then you can use auto resizing masks in all these, right? So then it's talking however, resizing must support relatively small subset of possible layers. So there are restrictions, so on and so forth, right? Then comes when it comes to auto layout, which is the focus on this lesson. So it says auto layout defines your interface using a series of constraints. Now you are aware of that, right? So we use this. So these constraints typically present a relation between the views, right? So then auto layout calculates the size and do all these changes, and this produce layouts that dynamically can respond to intent. So auto layout approach is much more convenient, is a much more convenient approach compared to the previous approaches. Something very important for you to keep in mind, right? So why we have this auto layout approach, guys.